Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Her Journey Told podcast. On this show, we will focus on strengthening women's mental fitness through sharing the joy, struggle, and wisdom of each woman's journey. Our show is powered by Pivotal Moments. Go to pivotalmoments.org to learn more. Hello, and welcome to the Her Journey Told podcast. This podcast is powered by Pivotal Moments Media. I'm your host, Sandy Lutton, and I'm so super excited today to be joined here today by my good friend and fearless leader of Equality League and founder, Mara Gubuan. Mara, welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. It's my pleasure.
So I know I saw you earlier this week, had the pleasure of seeing you in person, which is such a treat these days, and in New York. And I know you've been extremely busy. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And I'm just curious, what has the last 24 hours looked like for you?
Well, not only the last 24 hours, but the last 8 weeks have been rather stressful, to put it mildly. Equality League got involved in the Afghan humanitarian crisis because, of course, our mandate is to advance gender equality, and we're focused on access, equality, and safety for women and girls in sport worldwide. We know that Afghan female athletes are a vulnerable group. And so we've been helping with the evacuation and resettlement of a very large number.
Well, we all know, the whole Afghan situation is just horrendous, and there's no easy answers to how we solve this problem. And there's a lot of different people going at it in a lot of different directions. I'm just curious, have you seen successes? Can you share with us a little bit about, and I know you can't share a whole lot because I get a lot of this stuff is confidential and it's very risky for those people who are trying to get out of the country, but have you seen some success? Are there some positive things coming out of this?
There are. And actually, Sandy, this is a bit of a scoop. So you're exactly right. What you said is that the media in some cases can be very helpful. In this case, it's not helpful because there are success stories and wonderful dramatic stories, including by our friends who helped to evacuate the first group of footballers to Australia. They actually revealed some of their tactics, which was obviously successful and wonderful. But sometimes when people reveal their successful strategies, it closes the door for those behind them. And there are many, many behind them. And what I should say, the football community has been outstanding, really taking responsibility for the football athletes in their community. Whereas the reason Equality League is so deeply involved is because we saw that women and girls from other sports were really being left behind. There was no entity that was really taking responsibility and trying to help them find safe haven. The issue we have is that the Western world, including Americans like us and others, really use sport for empowerment and had very, numerous initiatives empowering women and girls in Afghanistan over the years when the Taliban were not in control.
Right.
So as a result, suddenly, they've resumed control and they're not in favor of female and empowerment. We've already seen that education has been restricted. And same thing with sport. It's been quite sad because many of the athletes actually burned their jerseys.
Wow.
Burned their certificates, buried their medals and trophies, so that they could remove evidence that they have been empowered and that they actually were empowered and both promoted in media. So even social media posts, they all had to remove their Facebook accounts, showing the wonderful victories and accomplishments, because that gives images for the Taliban to identify and possibly pursue and harm these individuals.
This was done out of fear of being called out for something that they were very proud of and are very proud of, but now it's life-threatening for them, right?
Oh, exactly. What's difficult, and we understand that there has to be some degree of criteria in order to prioritize who is at highest risk.
Mm.
We understand that, but they are at high risk. And again, in part because they've been exposed, they've been promoted, they've been celebrated in a
Right.
way that maybe some others, maybe a journalist who has a byline, but maybe their face isn't recognizable. There are
Right.
variations, and I don't want to say that one life is more valuable than another, but certainly these elite athletes have competed around the world. They've been exposed and revealed, and therefore very, very vulnerable. So that's why when you were asking me what I can say, we have been extremely quiet, my very, very small team, and we have really been kind of pained. We celebrate those who succeed in evacuating, but it's also painful when this comes out in the news because time after time, it shuts the route, it shuts the doors for those who are following. The small group that we're working with now they number 200, but we have a much larger master list that is now around 1,500. And so we want to be quiet so that we can get them out in smaller groups.
Wow. I mean, this really is potentially life or death situations that you're dealing with here. So I want to back up for a minute and go back to, so I know you as with many titles, right? When we first got connected, I knew that you were doing forensic accounting and work like that. You had started EQL, Equality League, and you were working on many, many different things and had touched so many amazing projects. How did you take us back a few years, and how did you get started? Because I know you started the organization several years ago. How did this all come about for you?
So this is actually my second nonprofit that advances women's rights and gender equality through sport. The first one was focused on Muslim female athletes strictly, and it really started out as being a media agency to sort of amplify images and stories because it wasn't widely known or supported that Muslim women athletes in other parts of the world, they weren't really known to be practicing. And it was something that was important so that some stereotypes wouldn't persist. There were empowered and there are empowered, very successful athletes, Muslim athletes. So I was with that organization, which again, it was really focused on media, but kind of helped to transform it into an advocacy organization. And we succeeded in forming a coalition, kind of creating a strategy for the first time, which we're using repeatedly, by finding an athlete as the affected individual to put at the center of an advocacy campaign, leverage our networks and resources around her in order to reach decision makers. And so that actually worked to overturn the decades-long hijab ban in basketball so that Muslim women could participate and compete internationally. So with that formula, I had a break between organizations, and then Equality League. I knew that we wanted to continue the work, but not restrict it to Muslims, but include all women and girls worldwide. So, and then we just jumped into that before we had a logo or our official name, because I observed and listened and read the impact statements of the Nassar gymnast survivors. And so by doing so, I searched who is doing this work on the topic of sexual abuse in sport, and specifically child sexual abuse in sport. And it was only Nancy Hogshead Makar, the founder and CEO of Champion Women. So when I realized she was doing this more or less by herself, I just contacted her, asked her, could I be of help? And that's how it started. And so we really are focused on that. And you will have recently seen even Simone Biles and testified again. This is ongoing, and it really does require a coalition to be pushing for this change. So that's one topic. And in America, Sadly, there are a few epidemics, and most of these problems are due to discriminatory policies and practices. So we're working on that, and then recently discovered again through Nancy Hogshead Makar that there's this terrible discriminatory gaps in between college and women in sport. So we announced a Title IX campaign, which will seek to close the $1 billion in scholarships, $162 million in recruitment, and innumerable hundreds of thousands of opportunities, meaning teams and spots, player positions, benefits and treatment that college women are just not receiving.
Wow. So you saw a need essentially, and you said, I'm going to take this on and I'm going to create this and I'm going to try to fill this gap, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, well, we pride ourselves on tackling like the hardest and the worst gender inequities. So, of course, we did the FIBA hijab ban overturn. Another recent victory was the overturn of the 40-year-old ban on Iranian women. The 41 million Iranian women and girls were not allowed to enter stadiums to watch men's football matches. And so you're exactly right. Where we see, or where I see that there is an egregious problem, we try to help solve it, because we know with my powerful board and our community that we can reach the decision makers. And so we call it grass tops advocacy.
I love it. So you just teed me up for my next question, because I know it takes a lot to do this type of work, but what does it take? I know it takes a community, it takes money, but what does it take? I mean, you have so much fortitude, and you just work tirelessly and fearlessly, which is one of the things that you've always inspired in me, is just to be fearless and go for it. But what does it take? If there was someone out there who said, I want to help too, what does it take? What do they need to do? What can they do? What are the options?
Mm-hmm. Well, Sandy, first of all, thank you for recognizing me for exactly who I am. I am small but mighty, and actually EQL is still small and mighty. What would help us certainly is if we had a real staff, a full-time staff. Basically, like, this work on the Afghan crisis was unexpected, and it's just because we understand and recognize it as a crisis that no one else is addressing, that we put all our other work on hold, including our fundraising. So I'm working with a wonderful colleague who's volunteered all her time. But the truth is, this is going to continue for months, several months and into years in terms of the resettlement process. But we're really only focused on the safe evacuation and then creating some playbooks, which will help the athletes to maintain their identities as athletes. Because as I mentioned, they destroyed evidence. And if you reach elite levels of sport, you know that this is somebody's passion and love. And we want to help them to restore and maintain their athlete identities by creating playbooks that are athlete-centered, so that communities can provide funding, equipment, and experiences to help with this resettlement wherever they're welcomed. So that it really does come down to funding. I'll just be very direct with you, because it is human hours that has taken so much. I would say the resources that we've depleted the most is our energy, our time and energy. And if we had additional staff, we would be able to allocate, take, what do you call it? Delegate. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with that word.
Well, you have to have someone to delegate too, right?
Basically, yeah, we need to delegate, and we could be a little even more effective and organized. Because I really must say that in this process, because we are a small team and because we have come to know the athletes and some of their dependents and coaches who we're attempting to evacuate, it's really been an emotional drain because we're mindful of what they're going through and we want to be supportive, but it is very difficult to field message after message. You're my only hope. When is it my turn? What happens next? And we're working with a wonderful ally, but they can only do so much because there are tremendous negotiations with different countries and the Taliban that are underway. So we can only try to be supportive, and that feels not altogether helpful.
Yeah. So I know a lot about your organization because I've spent a quality time with you learning about it. So one thing, so I noticed what happens in the work that you're doing is a crisis happens and you all jump in and step up and create a task force and really start trying to figure out what is the strategy behind solving this crisis. But you've also taken a different approach to how do we prevent crises. So talk a little bit about your youth council and the work that you're doing there and how you're training these youths to become advocates for themselves.
Yeah, thank you. That is, this group is something I'm very proud of. During the COVID quarantine, we just realized that the children had lost sport very abruptly, meaning all of their practices were canceled and they had a lot of free time. So I saw it both as an opportunity to kind of give sport back to them, but in a different way, in helping them to develop as advocates. And that was also somewhat selfish because I'm trying to create a pipeline of our successors so that I can retire. Like, I don't necessarily want to create every campaign and then execute it. What I thought would be great, and what we have now done, is that we created an athlete advocacy training program, which with a sponsor will be able to professionalize and distribute worldwide in multiple languages. And effectively, it's what we used to find the anyone who takes it. The athlete would be more or less the affected individual who creates their own campaign to make the changes that they want. So we actually recruited this youth council as our pilot group for the athlete advocacy training. But because the Equality League board is, in the thick of things, Nancy Hogshead-Makar, who had written the first draft of the Safe Sport Act and was also advocating to pass the Empowering Olympians, Paralympians, and Amateur Athletes Act, we realized the children could advocate in real time. So when I invited them to the council, my invitation said, please join me to influence the highest levels of U.S. government and sports governance. And they wrote a letter to Congress, and ultimately this Empowering Olympians Act will result in rewriting the rules of governance for the USOPC, the Olympic and Paralympic Committee, on down through all the national governing bodies to youth clubs. And it was all inspired by the Nassar gymnasts and the several congressional hearings that followed. It was clearly that there are problems with the policy and the environment. And so in real time, our youth council is getting involved. They're speaking up for themselves and their demographic, but actually their advocacy will help their role models and heroes in real time. So it's wonderful. Yeah, so we're also working, just to finish, we're also working on the equal pay issue to support the U.S. women's national team as well.
So they're inspiring the future generation. So give us a little bit, just a general profile of what your youth council looks like. What's the age, sports? Give us a profile of that.
Well, they're primarily teenagers. But we're really proud of them because it's mixed gender. We actually have 6 sets of siblings, nice. Sometimes boys and girls. But there's 16 in total. We now have 5 in college. So it's really most of the older high schoolers are leaders at the moment. But I must say, we have an 11-year-old who's very outspoken, and she's going to be a star. I know that. And that's what it takes. It takes some courage. And what we're doing is we're positioning them as messengers and amplifiers for the experts. They are not experts, but those who have come before them have studied the data and given us the language. That's what we're using, because the truth is people are interested in hearing what these student athletes have to say about their own protection and their own futures in sport. So in a way that sometimes an adult expert may not be listened to in the same way because they're advocating for the younger generations, the youth council is advocating for themselves.
So, obviously, we talk a lot about mental fitness here at Her Journey Told, and we like to share these stories of courage and how people find that and build that fortitude. And I hear what you're saying with this youth council. And I mean, we already know there's so much data out there about the positive mental aspects that sports has on an individual. And I love the fact that, in this country, we've been very fortunate that youth sports is a growing field. It's really important, and there's got to be gender equality in that. And you've got this younger generation who's come together now and supporting that and saying they're really raising up their voices to do that. Is there a way to get other people involved? How is this youth council inspiring other people to do the same?
Mm-hmm. So we're still working on this aspect of, being more public, but the platforms we will be using or starting to use are all digital, because that's where the children live. It's actually where their parents live, on these
Right.
Instagram accounts, on their phones. So when I said that there'll be messengers and amplifiers, most of the information will be conveyed via video, social media posts, Instagram live discussions, and so forth. So our goals are basically to build the community, to build the student athlete followers on Instagram, and most of their parents then on Facebook.
And how do you train these? I'm sorry. How do you train them to do this type of work?
Well, I'm laughing because it's still underway. We have a very carefully laid out plan and schedule. But the truth is, a lot of it, because this is new, advocacy is new, and it can also be scary. So what we're trying to do is really pair up or create smaller groups where they receive some individual attention from not only me, but I have wonderful volunteer advisors who are experts in media, journalism, former athletes themselves. So to train them, they're taking the online athlete advocacy training so that they understand the full scope of the process. But then these smaller pieces where for the digital content, we need some stories, or we need some interviews, we need some photos, that we're all doing those in smaller group sessions.
So I'm going to ask you some more personal questions now about the work you're doing. What has been the toughest project you've had to work on?
Well, I think maybe this one, because it's the Afghan evacuation, because this is the first time it really feels like life and death. And to think that sport is what is making them vulnerable, it's kind of shocking, because certainly we take sport for granted in other parts of the world. And so just to really understand that something that you love can really also be something that causes you harm, So I have to, maybe I could be able to articulate that a little bit better. But just to answer your question, I think that this Afghan attempt at evacuation has been the most difficult, because I also have little control in it. I am not personally negotiating with anyone. We're working in partnership with a wonderful sporting body that we trust, and are kind of the facilitators. We're in between, right? in between the athletes and actually those who have more power. So it's kind of hard when you don't have that power. It's hard when you know that you might be somebody's only hope for a future, and certainly a good future somewhere else. And then also that inevitably some will be left behind. And so we're really, as you mentioned, mental health. For my team, like, we're very clear that we also want to have therapy and some guidance on how we're dealing with this vicarious trauma from our empathy for what's happening. But then again, the decisions that are made, and we have to live with them. We'll have to, we're not professionals in this area. So we'll be sharing the lists of remaining Afghans with others, and sort of put our faith in others that they'll move forward, and that these names won't sit in a drawer somewhere for years.
Yeah.
So
and that's so interesting. Hard. You do say that. I mean, I understand the lack of control over the situation, but you do play a critical role in being the voice for these athletes and these activists. And, I think don't underestimate how powerful that is, because if it weren't for you and your team driving this message and getting it to the right people who do have some control over this situation, not that any of us really have control over it, but we're doing the best we can, right? So, I mean, I think that's such an important piece of it too. And it's so important to be able to give a voice to the people that don't have it. So kudos to you and your team for doing that. I mean, that's so important.
But also kudos to you, my friend, for inviting me. And as I said, this is a little bit of a scoop because we haven't spoken to anyone. And it's only because our partner FIFA did evacuate a group of around 100 yesterday. Amazing. And they had asked us that we don't want this to be public. And again, they're doing smaller groups. And so we have many who have not been evacuated yet. So we will eventually share more details. But for now, the only message we were trying to get, not to anyone, but the Afghans, was that you're not forgotten. Like, we're sticking with you. We're trying our best. And if we can't do it, we'll get to the people who can. So that was first and foremost, that we wanted the Afghan athletes and their families to know we're on it, because again, we didn't see anyone else taking responsibility. And that is my nature. That's Equality League. There was no hesitation when I informed my board that this is what I think we need to do. So, again, like, we just didn't see anyone else doing it. So I do like to step in where I think that I can be helpful. And there's no doubt, absolutely. And my colleague has been incredible. What I can say to you, this all began, and this is interesting, that we have one athlete ambassador from that very first organization who we transformed into an advocacy organization. This Afghan athlete had asked me if I could help evacuate her family members, which numbered 9 in total. And because I contacted the State Department, I learned that Equality League had referring partner status, and therefore we could refer others to be evacuated. And that's how this all began. If not for the one Afghan athlete who asked me to help her family, I wouldn't have known that we could help others. And so my colleague, Neda Ahmed, she contacted the Afghan member of the International Olympic Committee. And that's how we got the names of the entire national basketball team. We have volleyball teams, badminton, taekwondo, parkour, on and on. These were the athletes left behind.
Well, I think the work that you're doing is absolutely amazing. And the one thing that I'm drawing from this conversation is there is impact that one individual can provide, but the impact is multiplied, right? When you can build that coalition and bring that community together. So again, I say kudos to you for being able to do that and accomplish that. And I know this is an ongoing project. It will be for a while. And so I wanted to ask you, because I think most of your projects are similar to this, where they are ongoing. It's constantly something you're continuing to work at, getting legislation changed, changing people's minds, changing the stigma around things, changing discriminatory practices. Has there been a project that you've worked on that you said, wow, that was like, where have you seen a real success? Like you could say, wow, we can say we accomplished this.
Oh, well, the Iranian stadium ban overturn. Because also, you know, I'm an introverted tax accountant from Des Moines, Iowa. So the fact, like, actually, that I'm helping to evacuate Afghan athletes, what you said, Sandy, is true. Like, one person in the right place with the right intentions can make a difference. And, even just by, what I tell the youth council is that if you are just authentic in what you're attempting to do, people want to be part of your team, or they want to help you where they see that there are deficits. And I'm very open and clear when I say, I don't know how to do this, but you do. Like, will you help? And that, for the most part, people don't say no. They can understand that there's a genuine, authentic desire to be helpful. So, but with the Iranian stadium ban, because it had been in place for so many decades, and it was a creative strategy that we knew the real, people in power in the country weren't necessarily going to be the ones who we could influence, but we could influence FIFA because of the power of sport and football. They were able to influence the country. And that's how the strategy worked. So that was something really, I do feel proud that I contributed to that.
It's amazing. I'm always inspired by you. I feel so fortunate to be able to have access to people like you who, by the way, and I never can say no to you. You're so persuasive and you approach things in a way, but it's also because I see the work you're doing and the effort you put into everything you do. And that inspires me. I'm like, how could I say no to her? Because she is living and doing everything that she's asking other people to step up and do as well. So I appreciate that. I want to give the audience an opportunity to be able to support and help in some ways. So share with us your website for EQL, how people can donate, or if there are other ways they contribute. Let us share that with us.
Mm-hmm. Sure. We actually created a fund specifically to support the Afghan athletes, and our website is weareql.org. So there's a page, it's very clearly identifiable. And that support will not only go to help any of the operations, because as I mentioned, for 2 months now, some colleagues and I just launched into action. But this wasn't in, the EQL workflow. And so that is something that we're retroactively fundraising for. And then beyond that, there are just so many other logistics that it will be helpful to even just to support with additional staff members. And then beyond that, of course, we want to be able to raise funds so that we can help the Afghans once they evacuate to make certain that it's accomplished with dignity. We want to be able to supplement, maybe if we find that they need a little more than what's provided by the country who welcomes them. We just kind of want to build that up as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. There's so many stories here that we have just scratched the surface on. So I would love it if you would come back, share more details of some of these stories and projects that you all have worked on, but also give us an update when you can on the Afghan situation and how we can, as an audience, support that.
Well, as you won't say no to me, I won't say no to you, Sandy. So I'll be happy, and I hope that I'll have good news to share.
Awesome. Well, then my job's done here. I've won you over.
Long ago.
Right. Well, thank you again. This has been really great. I've enjoyed this conversation, and I know that our audience has too. You've been listening to the Her Journey Told podcast, powered by Pivotal Moments Media. Please join us for future podcasts episodes. You've been listening to the Her Journey Told podcast, powered by Pivotal Moments. For more inspirational content, go to pivotalmoments.org. I'm Sandy Lutton. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to keep an eye out for more episodes where podcasts can be heard. See you next time.